The moments, the immediate, the things that we can touch. You can't just like throw that out at someone and say, well, you need to just do better at staring at a sunset, like fucking Instagram pop psychology solutions. Yo, what's up? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who study philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And this is a little bonus episode. We got an email from someone and we felt like we couldn't adequately address it in just a response back in email form, so we decided to, with his permission, address it on air. Yeah, dude?
Yeah. What do you, if the main episodes are like an owl eating like a cat, what is this? Like the owl eating the mice? This is like a field mouse episode. Just a little snack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But a hearty one.
It's
high
definitely,
in protein.
It's going to be very rich in protein. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those emails that, a lot of times we get emails that are, they're not general, right? They're kind of very specific to the person or like individual. I mean, I guess most of them are actually general because a lot of them are philosophically oriented questions. But this one just seemed to be one that would be really beneficial for us to talk to out in the open because it's expressing some anxieties and frustrations that I think are quite common for post-evangelical, post-religious types. Yeah?
Yeah, exactly. It's it can feel in the midst of it very alienating and therefore make you feel very isolated. But if there's one thing we've experienced, I think, when doing this podcast, it's that, man, we are definitely not the only people who have similar experiences intellectually, emotionally, and otherwise. Lots of people out there have these experiences, so you're not alone.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's selection bias, but I do feel like every single person that reaches out to me in the DMs has been like fucked up somehow by religion. So it's obviously my view on the world is skewed because people are only going to reach out to me if they have like similar affinities as I do. But, I'm like, Jesus, man. But this is why I got to start my home church. Like, I say that jokingly, but also partially serious. But this is why there needs to be some sort of refuge for people, which is, I'm not sure that we often have access to such like social resources,
Yeah, I mean, regardless of the selection bias, just the fact that, I don't know what you think, but it seems like at least the interactions that I have that we get together, the majority of them for sure are around this one central issue. Like that seems to be the issue that people grasp or grab onto so much for the sake of actually, like wanting to reach out or email us or right, whatever other issues people like about the podcast or are able to empathize with. That seems to be the one that really connects people the most. So it's clearly a deep-seated issue for a lot of people.
Yeah. So, okay, let's get into the email. Yeah, dude?
Yeah, so we're not going to say the emailer's name, but he gave us permission to read a portion of the email on the podcast so we could then respond to it in detail. For some context, he is similar to us, grew up in an evangelical church, did some schooling to become a pastor, then changed his mind during that process. And he said that now he teaches MMA, which I'm sure is partially why you're involved, right? So he says, anyway, basically the problem is I have this constant feeling that everything is pointless. Sometimes I cannot think about it for a while and it will kind of go away, but eventually the thought or feeling comes back. Every time it does, I feel like it gets worse too. Right now, I'm up after sitting awake for 2 hours because this idea is giving me anxiety to the point it's hard to sleep. It feels like I have no agency, or if I do, it doesn't really matter. I thought because I'm a Christian that I would get some sort of inherent meaning from that. But even with that, the meaning is at best obscured or too difficult to know. It says we have a purpose, but only gives you a vague sense of what that is, or gives you a general purpose, not anything specific. And then he basically just says he's not really sure if he can explain it further than that, and wondering if we have any responses or things that might help with this situation.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because we literally have a segment on the podcast, right? About whether or not life is meaningless. And I think it's very romantic and easy for someone to just simply say, it's the sticky leaves, that crumple underneath that are fun. That's where you find meaning in potentially a meaningless world, or that that it's family, man, or that it's just find good projects that you can throw yourself into, which are all the stock answers that I could give, right? Like, I just finished reading some poetry by Walt Whitman that for me gave me a love, an affirmative type of love for, I mean, not that gave me, I think I've always had it, but helped reaffirm, kind of stimulated an affirmative love for the material world, for the sensations of the world, for the little, the moments, the immediate, the things that we can touch, right? But you can't just like throw that out at someone and say, well, you need to just do better at staring at a sunset, like fucking Instagram pop psychology solutions, right? Are just remember that every day is precious and you're precious and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, or, make Monday your bitch kind of stuff, man. Just remember, like, it's all on you. It's your individual responsibility to make sure you find meaning. And that's the romantic and maybe even the bad legacy that comes out of existentialism that I think has been weaponized within a particular socioeconomic regime, the one that we call neoliberalism, that you are
And the self-help kind of paradigm that bastardizes that.
Totally. Actually, there's I think her last name is Horney, which is a perfect name for her as a psychologist. But God, I can't remember her first name. I want to say Catherine Horney, but anyway, it's Horney, and she's one of these people that is really famous for popularizing self-esteem in the 20th century, and like the kind of pop psychology industry that culminates in like Oprah and in like now I think Instagram culture that I think it's been weaponized and it's so ubiquitous, but I don't think that it's giving us the resources because, and this is where I'm going to get philosophical, I think that in the wake of the death of God, in the wake of the death of meaning, those ultimate foundations that were meant to give us some sort of fixed position that can ground us, we do feel lost at sea. And Nietzsche writes about this, right? Like figures that boast even in the death of God are like, who put us in this terrible situation? Like Nietzsche's madman is a madman freaking out. And he even says that. He's like, shit, not shit, because Nietzsche doesn't write shit, but basically like, what are we going to do now that we have this terrible freedom, that we've been unmoored and detached from any sort of anchor, right? And it's fucking difficult is the first thing I want to say. And I'm not sure that there's an easy solution that we can just throw at somebody by saying, well, you just need to read more poetry and go to more concerts and find something better that you can invest your time into. I think we do need to do those things, but I don't think that's the easy solution. Does that make sense, dude?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the problem that I have, just most practically with this, like throw yourself into projects or like get out there and do stuff and you'll be fine, is the kind of person who's facing this sort of existential practical dilemma. What they're lacking is the motivation to do those things or to care about them. So telling them to go do them doesn't actually resolve anything. It's like telling a blind person to see, right? It's like, well, that's not going to help. So yeah, it seems to get the cart before the horse a little bit, right? Like someone has to actually care about projects to then find meaning in them, right? And so if you're sort of barred from finding meaning in projects because you're just like lacking at that moment care for anything, like symptoms of depression or something, then yeah, that easy solution of just throw yourself into stuff, of course, is not going to work. But that doesn't mean that like that you can't resolve the problem, that there's no way to fix it, right? But it does make it like a special kind of problem where the more obvious solution is the very thing that you're barred from doing, which is why it seems so insurmountable in the moment, right? Because the obvious easy solution, which works the rest of the time when you're not feeling that way, is not available to you.
Yeah, I had a friend actually that I was chatting with the other day, and she said something along the lines of how she's just in a funk at the moment. And I think that's a nice way of somebody saying that they're kind of like down in the dumps, right? And then she even mentioned like, oh shit, even like my libido is depressed at the moment. And it was really interesting because, it's when she was kind of describing that in that moment she has like no motivation to do anything, which is really shitty because this is one of those times of year where you think, okay, you've got Hanukkah, you've got Christmas, you've got the New Year, you've got joyful music, and you've got like a pressure almost to be happy. But the problem is if you are in a funk, like you don't even have the desire to be happy. Like you can't be happy. You become impotent. You like lose some vitality. And it almost becomes, I think, heightened even during this time of year for whatever reason, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because I don't think I've ever experienced this kind of thing that we're describing. I think I'm just really lucky at the fact that I kind of get really excited about the holidays, for
Mm,
instance, to give just one example. And I love being with family. I have a good family and everybody in the family I love and get along with, and never have any issues of that sort. And I don't get um, down in the dumps in that same way, or in the way in which you just sort of lack motivation or care for things. And so it's hard for me to truly empathize in the sense of like that which requires phenomenological
mm,
understanding, right? Like knowing what it's like to experience that. I don't have that, but so many people that I'm close to do, and that seems to be the common refrain, right? Is that you have this meta desire, right? A desire to
mm,
desire
mm.
things, right? So it's like an intellectual or cognitive sense in which you have this meta desire to
Yeah.
care and to be
I
involved in
want I want
projects,
to
and you
want to
like those
care.
things. And
I just don't want to care. Like not even that I don't care and that I don't want to care, but it's like I just want to care.
right, and that conflict with the meta desire to care, and then the lacking of an actual desire to care for anything specific. That's what creates, I think, the real problem because you have this conflict of meta desire and desire, and there's no obvious way to resolve that because the meta desire isn't fixing the desire itself, right? Just having the meta desire to want to care for things doesn't actually make you want to care for anything by itself. So it's a conflict at that like cognitive level, it seems like, and but you can't fix it
Yeah.
cognitively, right? Like you can't convince yourself to care about things. But what I think is really important
Mhm.
about that, though, is while it seems insurmountable when you put the problem that way, it actually, I think, points to a really important thing, which is, well, why would you have this meta desire to care for things? To even recognize that the way you're feeling right now is a problem that needs to be resolved in some way. Unless it's the fact that those things are good. Like you recognize those things are good, either intellectually or you like through your
Mm,
memory, thinking back to times when you did actually get fulfillment and meaning from those projects, probably more so the latter, right?
mm.
Don't want to over philosophize it by saying it's all like cognitive intellectual. Um, that tells you that you actually believe those things are good, but that at this moment there's this weird conflict between the meta desire and desire. So not only does that mean that it's surmountable eventually, right? Maybe not in the moment, but eventually. But it also leads you that you recognize that those things are good and that they're worthwhile and that they're worth caring about. You just are unable to muster the care at this moment. So there's like a malfunctioning going on in like your desiring complex or whatever. So there's some like I think some like minor hope in that recognition. The real problem would be if you don't even see the problem with feeling this
Mm.
way, right? Like, no, this is just the way that I'm supposed to feel. Like a real, like full on
Yeah, then you
nihilism
just
would look kind of like
pure
that, probably.
numbness. Right. Mm.
Not even recognizing that that numbness
Yeah.
is bad or that you shouldn't feel that way.
Huh. I mean, I think one of the things that he writes about is that, you know, the idea that somehow the promise of being a Christian would provide inherent meaning, but that even in that,
Mm.
that there's something missing. And I do think that I think a lot of people who are still a part of the church experience this. And so that the death of God thing isn't just like when you personally stop believing, or if you personally stop believing, or you start having doubts, or you move away from the confessional church. But I think that even in the church, there are a lot of people who still struggle. I mean, I know of many accounts of individuals who had breakdowns or were dealing with anxiety, I mean, I think we can just look at some of the kind of, quote, great figures of the history of the church that themselves struggled with doubt. You know, you look at Augustine, read Augustine's Confessions, for example. They are a testament to someone who was at the pinnacle of supposed religious piety, but then also has like a waging war within himself. And then look at Paul, right, in the New Testament. So, fuck, even Kierkegaard. I was going to say even Jesus, man. Like, there's the G.K. Chesterton line that even on the cross, Jesus becomes an atheist, right? You know, and then look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, now he's going through an extreme ordeal, but still, right? There's doubt there, right? That's what's unreal, I think, about recognizing this. And I wonder if we don't beat ourselves up with like extra pressure because we don't like reconcile ourselves with doubt. And so then we take on even a greater burden because somehow we aren't like, we hold up this supposed image of the preacher that is pious and happy with the family and everything is great. And we measure ourselves against that. And then we see ourselves as even being more wretched. And then, of course, you have this like post-Luther, post-Calvin, like morose self-flagellation that only intensifies that. And we beat ourselves up because of our supposed iniquities, you know? And that only just intensifies and deepens our guilt.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting. I have some like weird misgivings about the whole doubt thing because I definitely, like both of us, I think, come from the trajectory of thinking doubt is a necessary condition of like true faith, right? That a faith without doubt isn't really a faith. It's really more of a cover for insecurity. Like it's a way to cover for the doubt you actually have and like repress it. And that's like a false faith. But a true faith constitutively is made of doubt, at least in part, right? And that comes from like Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and like all the great ones, right? But then from our circles, like coming from like fundamentalist kind of circles where doubt is often frowned upon, at least publicly, doubt becomes kind of sexy, you know? It's like doubt, like the guy who says that he doubts and is willing to admit it is always like a dude who says this, right? He's like the dude in the leather jacket who smokes a cigarette.
Oh, yeah. And then people are like, wow, you're so
right?
brave.
I know, right? To doubt. So doubt always became like this cool thing.
Yeah.
Like the one person who, well, you can't really, this person has like a powerful position, right? So they can kind of risk a little bit. It's like when a politician comes up and says, you know, that they've made some mistakes in the past, right?
Yeah.
It's like, as long as they don't actually have to change anything about what they do, then they can say that and score some points for admitting to some fault. It's like, I think one time someone told me the best thing you can do at a conference, academic conference, is say you don't know to one of the questions.
Yeah.
But definitely don't say it twice because that's the worst thing. Saying I don't know once makes you humble, makes you look like, you know, you have some like self-awareness. But if you say it twice, then actually people are stupid. And doubt's kind of the same way, right? Just enough doubt makes you sexy. And so we kind of fetishize it, I think, a little bit in some fundamentalist circles. But what does that transform into if and when you sort of leave the faith, or at least have a faith outside of the sort of institutional confines that you sort of were formed in? And it seems like a totally different thing, right? Like the way that the kind of constitutive role doubt plays in faith, I don't think I find that outside of those circles. Like whether in political or philosophical or whatever kind of circles, there's still obviously intellectual doubt about things, right? But you don't have that like all-encompassing faith trajectory.
Like the metaphysical questions, like our place in the world.
Like resurrection of the dead.
Yeah.
Resurrection of the dead, God exists, stuff like that. The role that doubt plays, which is like, you know, humbling and stuff like that. There's different things that humble you in other circles, but I don't know that there's a doubt in that same way. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And I think I mentioned this before. I literally want to write a book on like the politics of certainty and then a politics of doubt is what I want to call the book. Because I do think that you're not allowed to doubt. There's like no capacity to doubt in a world of technological rationality, right? You might not have all the information. You might not have all the inputs. But that's okay. That's just because that's a product of like inductive reason or something like that, right? but there's always like a certainty that we just need a little bit more information. We just need more data. So you don't doubt the method. You don't doubt the foundations upon which you stand. You just might be unsure about where you currently are in your algorithmic processes. But it doesn't allow for it. It creates a sort of a type of certainty that you must be beholden to, which is, I think, a very different vision of what is reality and who we are and what we are as human beings and how we ought to comport ourselves and orient ourselves with others and with the institutions that condition us. And I think that actually that there's something we can learn about that, as you called it, that constitutive doubt, by looking at like the Dostoevskys and the Kierkegaards. I look at the existentialist tradition, psychoanalysis. I think that I've found good intellectual resources in there to, as Todd McGowan says, not reconcile contradiction. You don't overcome all contradiction, but rather become reconciled to contradiction, which is a very different orientation in and to the world. It's not about overcoming all of these tensions and disjunctions, but rather it's, in psychoanalytic terms, it's that adjustment to those tensions, which is not, again, easy. It's easy for me to speak those words, but to really meditate on that and to live that and embody that is, I think, a very noble goal, and one that I find to be extremely important. And I think at the moment, a sort of beacon almost, that is kind of like, that my gaze is fixed on, that is guiding my trajectory. So,
yeah, that's really good. I think that this idea of the constitutive doubt, like you look at the Kierkegaardian model, right? For Kierkegaard, the reason why faith has to include doubt as a necessary condition is that doubt itself is what allows faith to become faith, which is like, a risk, and it's a leap. And then that's the only way you can really commit to it. If you knew something for sure, it was purely an object of like intellectual assent to certain knowledge, then you wouldn't actually be able to be motivated to care for it. It would just be another thing, right? So in order to be motivated to actually dedicate yourself, to really commit to something fully, you have to have doubt. It's a condition of that being the case in the first place, of real commitment. And I think that's true. And what you're saying there, I think, maps on pretty neatly, because I think, and this also goes to like practical matters like our emailer's talking about, if you were able to fully understand why things are meaningful and when they should be and shouldn't be, and like just form a matter of intellectual assent to them, then because of how human beings are and how subjectivity works, then you wouldn't care for it. Really, the only way to truly be able to care for a thing is to go through some process of this constitutive doubt, right? Of acknowledging that maybe it isn't meaningful after all. Maybe it isn't worth it after all. I don't know. But that I don't know actually puts the steps before you to eventually be able to fully commit to it. And in politics, especially, and I think in like our personal lives, in terms of our personal projects, that's just not available. Like no one thinks that way, right? We all think, no, you have to like have everything in place and fully understand, have all the arguments and defeat everyone else's arguments, and then you can sort of, make the fire tweet that convinces everybody to become a socialist or whatever, right? And that's just not how it works. It certainly isn't the way how it works in like religious faith, right? But it really isn't the way how it works in politics or in philosophy or in our personal lives. I think that you're right, that there has to be a role for doubt in all these areas. And it'll look different in the different areas, right? But there has to be some role there for doubt, not for the sense of like, a lot of like the liberal tradition has this sort of humility about it that's like, well, we don't really know what the good is, so we're going to build a system that like coordinates the best amongst all of the various ignorances that exist between individual subjects, right? But that's like the ultimate in not doubting, because it's like, no, we all have these epistemic limitations, but we can fully know how they all coordinate together to make the best possible system without anybody really stepping over the bounds and saying what's good. Right? So in some ways, it's like the least humble of all systems, even though it couches itself.
That's why I constantly say that it's metaphysically arrogant. It's not aware of those metaphysical priors, and therefore metaphysically ignorant, and then it becomes epistemologically arrogant because of that. And it's like the person who is just unaware of his or her own biases and becomes the dogmatist, you know, and they aren't even aware that they're a dogmatist. It's like the nice Christian person, not the one who's the asshole that's like beating you over the head with the Bible, but the one who just like is the true believer, you know. And it's like, well, you just don't even know about these other foundations, and therefore that's why you end up becoming arrogant in your kind of supposed certainty.
Yeah, and that, maps onto the same stuff from the email that we're talking about. Is there isn't an easy answer. It's a process, right? Not a destination that we're talking about here. How to engage in the process meaningfully and effectively. And in life, sometimes you're going to have, like, obviously, like psychiatric issues that you really need to address at the medical level and to seek help that way. And then other times you'll have areas where it's just like a temporary interstitial thing in your life, and everyone goes through it at some point in their life, maybe multiple times, where they just lose that connection to other people and to the various projects they're engaged in into the world. And, there isn't a pill you can pop necessarily to just make that all go away. Well, maybe you can, but then that creates other problems of its own. But recognition of the fact that this is a real thing, like this happens, and it's part of the sort of doubt about what a good human life is. Like, if we knew exactly what it meant to live a good human life, then we wouldn't need philosophy, right? But two, we wouldn't even really be human beings at that point. We'd be some other kind of like all-knowing species. So given what we are, we shouldn't be surprised that these kind of things prop up, right? And that doesn't mean that they're unimportant. They're super important. But they are in and of themselves a recognition of like human subjectivity.
Yeah.
And that's important in and of itself, being able to recognize what you're lacking in the moment. That's a good thing.
Is there anything in particular, as like a final note, that has helped you primarily deal with these things?
I mean, like I said, I don't know that I've ever really gone through something unlike what the email describes. Certainly been sad, down in the dumps, times when I wasn't fully motivated to do the things that I usually am.
But that deeper longing of a sense that there is no meaning, or maybe like coming out of the confessional church, helping you in that transition.
Yeah, I think, and you can speak to this too, I completely lacked the support network outside of like my family. But, at the time I was living abroad, and I think for a lot of your period of going through that process, you lived abroad too, right? And that makes it so much harder to not be around people who care for you. So yeah, I mean, if you have the privilege of having people around you in close proximity who care about you, it can be hard to want to do this or to make yourself do this, but just to being around people who care can help with that. And that means, having good people who are also in close proximity, which can be difficult for a lot of people, but that's certainly a thing.
Yeah, and for me, it wasn't even necessarily being around other people who are experiencing the same negative passions as me, but even just being around like good people, like
people who are
just about stuff,
who are not
exactly, just about stuff.
Definitely, even preferably not people who are going through the same process.
Yes.
Like, obviously, you want to empathize with people who are, but then to also have people who are not is helpful as well.
Yeah, not because it's a distraction, but I think because it kind of creates, you used the word connection a minute ago, and I think we say that in like a sentimental sense oftentimes, but I'm going to say that in like the ontological sense. Like, think Deleuze and Guattari and the idea that they talk about like, the wasp and the flower, the bee and the flower, that kind of like come together and they create this machine, right? This machinic assemblage, they call it, that as they come together, like one's vitality is constituted in its connection with the other's vitality and vice versa, right? And then they detach and then they go and they make other connections later on. The breeze that comes and carries the pollen from the flower, or the dew that falls from the tree onto the flower. Like, those are all different connections that are creating different like domains or intensities of potency. And then it's the same with the bee. The bee then goes to a different flower, goes and communicates with its other bee friends, and then whatever the fuck it's doing. I don't understand the phenomenological experience of a bee, so I can't speak to it. But Like that's it, man. Is finding those connections for me, I think was the thing that helped me because it one distracted me so that I wasn't just sitting in my room, mortifying my sin, so to speak, and beating myself up. But then two, I think it also introduced me to other interests and other things and to other aspects of life and to like the vital impulse that might be there that was kind of contagious for me. And then also there's just something like primal about empathic connection, you know? And I mean everybody has the triggers that make them thrive a little bit more. For me, it's a joint, a few beers, and some really good music, and I feel like I'm in ecstasy. Um, but yeah, those things were important for me, and I'll be honest though, I started, and I know you did too, but like I started moving away while I was still a part of the confessional church. For me, it was going to that emerging church, with a quote emerging church. It wasn't emerging church, but Copper
Hmm.
Hill, where I felt a freedom. Like I feel oftentimes restrained, even now from my dad. I had a buddy that say, "Oh, maybe the reason that you live away and that you moved abroad and that you don't come back is because you can be free abroad." And I was like, I've been thinking about this a lot for the last year or so. Because when I'm home, I feel like sometimes I'm walking on eggshells. There are certain things I don't tell my dad. I can't tell my dad for fear of judgment. And it's not even like he has some sort of control over my life, but it's just he's my dad and I want to please him. And I know that I can't because I'm not like serving Jesus in the way that he wants me to. And so therefore I just don't even bring things up. And so when we talk now, we just don't even acknowledge things. And living abroad and living away, I can do what I want, be what I want, say what I want without any fear that it's going to be smashed down, right? And there's something that I found even when I was in the church that allowed me to kind of like in Copper Hill, because it was a safe place. And I know we use the word safe space, and I don't mean that in like the loaded cultural term, but it was literally a safe space where I was outside of the judgment of the evangelical eye because I knew I had other people there that would prop me up if I felt that being beaten down, you know? And it was a safety
Hmm.
net for me outside of the judgmental, watchful eye of the big other, of the church, of, the president of our university, the church history, orthodoxy, the confessions, my family, whatever. And I've just expanded that now into a sort of even like post religious setting, which is my vagabonding, my bohemian vagabonding around the world, which is my own like romantic church in my own mind, you know?
Yeah, dude, and it's so important to have those things.
Yeah.
It's like there's such a what do you call like a Bill Maherism, like a segment of liberals who just castigate all religion as being like one monolithic evil in the world, right? And then kind of wonder why millennials and Gen Zers are going through like this seemingly insurmountable bouts of depression and anxiety,
Yeah.
and in response to all the economic and political concerns of the day. And it's obviously not exhaustively this, but part of it is millennials and Gen Zers have kind of en masse left the church because they see, and usually it's the hypocrisy of their parents, right? Like I read that the number one cause of people leaving the church is witnessing hypocrisy at an intimate
Mm.
level, like with people that you know well, being hypocritical. That is what causes you to lose your faith. And usually, people leave the faith or kind of become disinterested and then come back when they have kids. But millennials are not doing that, and it's kind of like this kind of statistically like a statistical
Mm.
outlier that millennials are not coming back after having kids, not raising their kids in the same religion that they were
Mm.
raised in. And I think that this doesn't mean that like religion's like monolithically good, obviously, but there is something missing when you grew up in that kind of community, which has some degrees of support and some degrees of judgment, intermixed, and often more of the latter than the former. But when you leave the judgment zone, you also leave the support zone, and it's probably worth it. I know for me, it's worth it to lose both than to keep both. But that doesn't mean it's not a loss. It absolutely is still a
Mm.
loss. And I think we should recognize it as such, not pretend that it's like infantile to want that support system, or that it's like wishing to be back into the womb or something like that.
Totally.
Like just needing to be hugged, or some like, being a pussy or something.
Yeah.
No, like that's a real thing that everybody needs. And the fact that we lack it outside the church is a real problem.
Yeah. And then, of course, to get political, if we are going to try to build a state, build communities, build nations, build larger sort of segments of populations living together, it would really be beneficial for us to try to create those social support systems, which means that you have safety nets that are social safety nets. How are they propped up? How are they funded? How are they developed? How are they maintained? Those are all difficult strategic questions. But nevertheless, I think part of the reason that we're feeling that malaise at a heightened point is that we live in a system that, like you just said, says you're just a pussy if you don't get this. Like, suck it up and just, make Monday your bitch kind of mentality. Just suck it up and throw yourself into your work. Manage your portfolio, your capital assets, become a better entrepreneur of the self, rely on yourself kind of bullshit. And so that's why we get kind of stranded, is that we have a society that itself has been fractured. There's this shift towards individuality, like a radical individuality, but yet there's no real way in which, that we can deal with the fact that we have like crumbled our social support systems, or at least we've felt that we have crumbling support systems. Whether or not those support systems were ever perfect in the past is obviously, I don't want to be too nostalgic about like 1950s, New Deal era capitalism or something like that. But nevertheless, we don't have our like Rotary clubs and our bowling clubs and our unions and, the things that were binding people together of previous eras, because we are in a much more fractured society. And so the question is how can we now rebuild social safety nets in a new era? And that, I think, is a very noble project to think through and to consider and to strive towards at a political level.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, kind of to sum up, I think what we're saying is there's obviously no easy answer to these problems. And that's why so many people go through them and why they seem so insurmountable, because they are these huge issues. But recognition of the fact that it's a problem is like the first step. And it's a good thing to recognize that, right? You're actually in touch with your humanity when you recognize the fact that you're lacking and that you're suffering by not being in this position of not being able to care about things or lacking meaning. And then the project from there is to build up those things. And it's super hard. And a lot of people unfairly don't have access to doing that the way other people do. And that sucks, really sucks. And should be recognized as such. But that is the project, right? At the institutional level, the public level, at the private level, with individual people. It can happen at all those levels, right? They all influence each other and are symbiotic. And that's the project, is to build those things.
Yep. So thanks for the email, brother. Definitely reach out to us anytime with questions and things like that. We are not psychologists. We're not therapists. We're just dudes who have studied philosophy and have similar experiences. So definitely, I would also recommend to go seek professional help. I have been to a therapist, and I have had a tremendous gain in being able to talk with someone who is professionally trained to help me deal with some of these things at an individual level. So I definitely recommend that as well. I know that especially for dudes, we might think, nah, dude, I'm cool, I'm fine. Or we might even think like, no, it's not that serious. I don't need that. And I think that was for me the one that I'm like, yo, I'm not depressed. Like, I'm okay. But then I was kind of like, well, but maybe that's just my stumbling block. I'm just being resistant, So I would definitely recommend to try and find someone that you can talk to. And you don't have to find the perfect person. Just sometimes even just going and meeting with someone, just to open up that door, to kind of open up that crack, is beneficial. But yeah, that's the last thing I'll say.
Yeah, for sure.
Sweet. Well, we love you guys. Email us if you have any questions. We'll do the best we can to address our emails and to kind of wade through issues like this. And then hopefully just the series of stuff that we're constantly working through on the episode can arm us with ammunition to be reconciled to contradiction rather than needing to overcome it all and fix everything perfectly.